Your first in the league, Winnipeg Jets, are now looking to add to their lead and also looking for a bit of a trade come up. Let's chat about that on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, we are chatting about Winnipeg versus Carolina, which will be tomorrow. Going to be a big game. Carolina is yet another upper-end echelon team that the Jets haven't seen in a while, and this is following a big game against the Capitals, another tough test. Now, Washington really pushed the Jets to the limits, and Winnipeg's depth lines, I think, on top of, Josh Morrissey kind of doing Josh Morrissey things, really helped carry the day. Now, we really need to see the Jets' top line step up, and I want to chat about that against a Carolina team that's gone through a big trade in just a brief moment. Before we dive into that, though, did want to let you know that tonight's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. New customers can bet just $5, and if you win, you'll score $200 in bonus bets. Download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. Now, like I said, Winnipeg is coming into this with a rather big need for continuing the current pace. Obviously clinching the playoffs is still a ways away, but Winnipeg has continued to add to its Western Conference lead. It is still at the top of the league. And, with all of these teams chasing them, the Jets could probably do with cementing their top seed to make sure that home ice advantage during the playoffs continues to be a thing. More importantly, though, I think I want to see how this team does against really good opponents. For a while, the last 10 or so games, the Jets haven't faced that many truly great opponents. Washington was one of the rare exceptions, and that game was pretty close. Winnipeg got an early lead, really controlled the first 20 minutes, and then it was a lot of back and forth until Washington really put their foot on the pedal and started, causing the Jets to make mistakes. So this Carolina team, it's probably as close to another competitor as we're getting for the foreseeable future, right? When you look at their team and some of their lines, you've got up front Jackson Blake, Aho, and Rantanen. Blake, obviously an NHL rookie, just kind of starting out in the league, but apparently he's been pretty decent. On the second line, a little bit of a game time decision, but Svechnikov, Kakaniemi, and Hall will be together. On the third, you've got Martinuk, Stahl, and Jarvis. And then on the fourth, Robinson, Yost, if he's good to go, and Roslovic. When you look at this team, it's really weird because there's a lot of players who I think provide some really good, depth scoring. But outside of the first line, right, you don't see a lot of top-end super elite finishers. But this Canes team has generally been pretty strong this season. They've had one of the better offenses in the East. They're only trailing the Caps by about 6 team goals total, which is pretty impressive. I wouldn't say that they are quite as prolific offensively as someone like, say, the Jets, especially when it comes to the power play, but they are a pretty tough team. They've got a pretty good goal differential, and when you look at their overall record, they've generally been good. They're 6-2-2 in their last 10 games. And if you look at who they've beaten recently, they aren't slouches, right? The Canes have beaten, Vegas. They've beaten Dallas. They've beaten Columbus, who have really turned it around this season and have only been punctuated by a couple of losses here against the Kings. And, surprisingly, the Islanders somehow found a way through them. But, any given Sunday, as they say. Where, you traditionally see a lot of Carolina's value is on the back end. You've got Slavin and Burns as your first pairing, Orlov and Chatfield as your second, and Gostisbehere and Walker as your third. This is an interesting one. This is a mobile, high offensive unit, one that I think that is potentially going to give the Jets a couple of problems. But I think the bigger storyline here is that I feel like Winnipeg does have a chance to take down this team. In fact, I think the chance is pretty good. Outside of the first line, a lot of the finishing is more in tertiary scoring, and I just think the Jets have a bit of an advantage when it comes to teams that are built like this. Traditionally, the teams that have given the Jets fits are the ones that have like super elite talent up and down the lineup, a couple of key positions where, on any given shift that team's players take over. I don't think Carolina is built the same way. They're a little more diversified. They have more depth up and down the lineup. And I think, you look at guys like Jarvis as being particularly scary. Rantanen, of course, we all know pretty well. Aho is still Aho. Outside of that, though, you don't see a lot of like crazy high-end names that are immediately scary. I did actually forget that Hall is now a Kane. That was a thing that happened as part of the whole deal. But otherwise, I think the Jets have a pretty good opportunity. And, one of the things that's kind of helpful is that, you've got Kochetkov and Anderson and net. I would say that advantage Jets here. You've got Hellebuck and Comrie. I think that that's probably a much better pairing. And for the Jets, this should be a chance to come away with at least a point. It's not guaranteed, but it is a home game. Winnipeg has had a day or so of extra rest, and I feel like the Jets are just kind of coming into their own recently. Overall, I think Winnipeg's depth lines and really their second line downwards have really started to put together some strong games. The trio that I do question a little bit is the top line. Will we see what we saw against the Caps? The Jets' top line then was not a top line. They were just not, well, I want to say they were just okay. They actually didn't really meet that mark. They were bad. I don't want to single out any one group because there were multiple players who were struggling. DeMello had an awful game, and he wasn't the only one. But I think for Winnipeg, again, what I've always said about the top line is that you want to see them actually do well against really good playoff teams. And I'm still not yet convinced that they're going to be the ones that really lead the way. Against bad opponents, they kind of, take care of business. But when you start seeing these LAs, the Vegases, the Colorados, the Washingtons, you start to see where those cracks form. And I do wonder what carries over into the postseason. But a game against the Canes has a chance to, put some doubt to that theory. Maybe this top line will really get rolling. You can see them occasionally make some really fancy passing plays and stuff. It's just a matter of consistently trying to execute and getting at the same page on at 5v5, right? That continues to be one of the only areas they really struggle. When they've got time and space, there is never a problem with them. But at even strength, when you're facing fast, skilled teams, you just aren't going to get that, and that's what you're going to have to play predominantly at when it comes to the playoffs. So curious to know what comes out of this one. I'm going to say 4-2 Jets, though. I think Winnipeg is going to get a power play or two. I think that's going to be a big difference maker, and I expect a 7th straight win for a team that is currently on a 6-game winning streak. But curious to know what your score predictions are. Drop those in the comments below. Pretty nice time for the Jets to start, putting together a win streak. They're 8-2 in their last 10, and I would say, for the most part, the way that they've generally played has been pretty impressive. So very interested to see where the Jets finish with their goal differential at the end of the season, especially at 5v5. So much of their scoring this year has come off of the power play, and I really feel like that's helped them cement one of the craziest home records in the league at 25-3. Winnipeg is a fortress, and so securing that home seed before the postseason is going to be an absolute must. But let me know what you're thinking from this game or what your score prediction is in the comments below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. While we're at it, I did want to chat about a little bit of the shifting trade sands. A lot continues to change around the Jets, and I want to talk about some of the Central Division moves, how they've really shaped what I think is a much better path for the Jets through the West, and what ultimately is going to happen for Winnipeg to, in my mind, really slam it out of the park when it comes to the trade deadline. But before we dive into that, did want to let you know about our friends and partners at FanDuel. Super Bowl 59 is here. 1 game, 2 teams, endless possibilities. There's no better way to make every play more exciting than with FanDuel Sportsbook. Whether it's predicting the first touchdown, figuring out who takes away the MVP of the series, or even betting on the coin toss, FanDuel makes it easy to get in on the action. With live betting all game long, you can adjust your bets as the game unfolds and feel the thrill from kickoff to the final whistle. Right now, new customers can even place a $5 bet and potentially win $200 in bonus bets for the Super Bowl. It's just icing on the cake, and it's on top of a great app that's super easy to use, safe, and secure. If you want to get in on the action for the Super Bowl, download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. Remember, just bet $5, and if you win, you'll score $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Bet with FanDuel, official partner of Super Bowl 59. Hey friends, welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we were chatting about some of the interesting things that have shaken out. Obviously, I have a little bit later this episode a focus on the defenders. Murat Atesh from The Athletic put out an article listing a number of potential trade targets. I want to assess which of the guys on his list I'm particularly interested in, but before then, let's chat about the overall landscape because the trading landscape has changed considerably. A couple of guys that I was kind of concerned the Jets might go after are off the board. Marcus Pettersson got traded for one thing, which I think, for Vancouver, I like Pettersson, but I don't quite like the price. It was like a first and something else. And like Pettersson is a nice top four left-handed D who would have been a clear upgrade for the Jets, probably for the third pairing. But I think the Jets are really chasing a little more than that, right? Especially for the price. Vancouver paid a pretty hefty premium. And in my mind, how I kind of look at this is that Winnipeg needs to be smart about when it strikes. The Jets have traditionally waited for teams to start falling out of the playoffs late. They'll like to strike with a team that's maybe borderline and just not quite there, and they can come away with a really big discount. I look at the Toffoli and Monahan deals where, last year those teams were not necessarily in playoff contention and weren't really as much threatening to make a run, but the Jets still kind of tried to be a little bit patient. Monahan, they did kind of have to spring a little bit earlier. But you think back to the Stastny deal, in 17-18, and that one kind of came out of nowhere. There were very minimal links. No one was really looking that way. And the Jets kind of struck right after Brassard was, I think it was Brassard, ended up going to Vegas. So Winnipeg is always patient. They're smart. And I think that's when they know the moment is right that they'll strike. And I think so far the moment hasn't yet been right. Winnipeg is seeing the team generally playing well without Lowry right now. So I think that there's been a little less urgency to try and get something going here, especially for a big center. That's probably a little bit of a relief for Winnipeg because it means you can accrue extra cap space instead of bringing in another contract. But for the Jets, right, Mikael Granlund, who I was kind of worried Winnipeg might be after, is off the board. He's to Dallas with Cody Ceci. They paid a first rounder and a conditional pick. And in my mind, barring a surprise, they are probably done for the deadline. I think they used pretty much all of their available cap space on those two players, and I don't really think that they actually improved. Granlund does help with the finishing, and that's maybe one of their bigger concerns, but I can't really say that CC is going to significantly change that blue line. I could be very wrong about this, but I just look at that duo and I think, that's a really hefty price for what I think Dallas is getting out of it. Ever since last season, it kind of seems like they've just really struggled to recapture the magic. And so for the Jets, that's great. Dallas is one of those teams that has notoriously given the Jets trouble in the regular season, and if they're no longer as much of a factor in the postseason, that can only mean good things for Winnipeg. Any Central Division team that starts to get easier to beat in the playoffs has to be good news for the Jets. Another team that I think is kind of fading is Minnesota. They have dealt with an injury crisis, and they're just not that good. So they may make a trade or something. I don't quite know how they're going to approach this. Kaprizov is made of glass, and with that in mind, I just don't know how the Wild are going to try and dig themselves out of it. They're all the way in third place, but it's not a very stable third place in the division, and I think Colorado's probably the more likely of the two to come away with the number 3 seed. The Avs, for their part, with Nietzsche's in tow, I think, swapping Nietzsche's for Rantanen out, given what, came back in that whole deal, it makes sense for the Avs, but I kind of feel like Colorado is trying to figure out some way to prolong their window just a bit more. So long as Makar and McKinnon and company continue to do what they do, I don't know that they're necessarily too worried. They probably have at least one more deal somewhere in the pipelines waiting in the wings to strike, and I'm curious to know what that is. I think they probably want to upgrade on Casey Middlestat. Not quite sure how else they're going to try and address some of their consistency issues. Because, the team is good, and, they're fast and skilled, but they do concede a fair few. I know that the goaltending duo has been changed out, and so maybe that's going to have a more stark impact as they go deeper into the rest of the season and into the playoffs. But I think compared to where they've been in the past couple of years, they don't scare me quite as much as they used to. Do I want to meet them in the playoffs? No. but am I as concerned about them? Probably not. Same with like Vegas. I think the Knights are still a very strong team, but you look at their last 10, you look at kind of the up and down performance that they've had. They're not getting as many saves. There just seems to be something up with them, and maybe it's just fatigue. They've played a lot of games in the postseason over the past couple of years. Maybe age is catching up with some of their top players. I don't know, but I think for Winnipeg, it all just seems to be setting up for a year in which I continue to say you've got to go all in. And I know people will say I'm not that interested in making trades. I don't want to mess with the chemistry. It's not really about that, right? Chemistry is important, but it's not the most important thing. The most important thing is, can you find really good players to help this team? If you do, their skill will take over, and their line mates will figure out how to play with them. Monahan and Toffoli did actually kind of fit here. It's just that they were slow, and that was kind of the problem. I think it may have been Friedman, or maybe it was one of the other podcasts, maybe Jeff Merrick or something. They were talking about it earlier today, and apparently, the suggestion is the Jets want big and fast, which is basically what every team wants. Big and fast for the postseason is always like your ideal archetype, right? But I think for the Jets especially, it's how they want to kind of body teams, and they want to get up the ice quickly. So with that in mind, a Brock Nelson or something of that nature continues to be attractive. But I think one of the problems for Winnipeg is that the Islanders are actually kind of in a playoff spot-ish. They're fighting for, a wild card. They are still in the mix. And that's going to be a problem for Winnipeg. I think the Islanders are probably one of the most natural trade partners, but Barzal is now out indefinitely with some lower body thing. Nelson, of course, they're going to probably view as an internal rental. They are 7-3-0 in their last 10 games. I think this whole run has probably put them too close to the playoffs for Uncle Lou to really do what I think he should and start tearing it down. There's also been, I forget who even mentioned this, but Jean-Gabriel Pageau was kind of discussed a little bit. Apparently, the Jets have had some interest in Pageau in the past. A little less enthused with that. I think that there are better ports of call if you're looking for some kind of an upgrade like that. But it does sort of feel like some of the names I've been looking at are kind of being crossed off. Yanni Gourde had like sports hernia surgery, so I would very much not be into that. The Kraken in general, I don't know if they're going to be the ideal trade partner for the Jets. I could see, some kind of a deal involving like Jared McCann, maybe a Bjorkstrand or something. That is interesting to me. I think I mentioned on a previous episode, kind of doing a one-stop shop. With Gourde now out, that starts to get a little bit trickier because I think Gourde was probably one of the guys who would have been easiest to convince to come to Winnipeg. Most of these guys have some level of trade protection or no trade or no movement clause. So, it does get a little finicky. But for the Jets, the field has never really been more open for them than it is right now. A lot of the teams that were better last year have taken a step back. And so for me, this feels like a really prime opportunity. I know that I've kind of talked about the top line struggling and stuff, but I say all of this with the kind of back pocket knowledge that the league itself, generally speaking, there's not that many teams that overall really frighten you. It's just the ones that the Jets might face in the postseason, to where you want to arm yourself with as many options as possible. If your top line starts to really suck it in the playoffs, then having a middle six that's basically 2 second lines worth of talent would be fantastic. That's the insurance you want. The Jets can afford to take on that salary, especially if they play their cards right. And I think that they don't have to pay insane premiums, but I will say, I'm not averse to doing something really smashing if the right trade arises. Now, comments last episode, somebody mentioned about trading Velarde, and I think that that's actually a more interesting proposition than initially you might think, right? Velarde is a very good complementary top six swinger and a guy who I quite frankly would like to extend longer term, but I could also see him being moved in a deal if you're looking at like a Pettersson type, right? That's the caliber of player I would only be interested in if you're talking about him or Perfetti, guys in that tier. Partly because the package that would be included would be pretty significant, pretty hefty for an elite franchise level player, but you're going to have to give up quality to get even more quality. And so in that respect, I think that that's probably the only way that I would really want to move Velarde. Do I think that he's an untouchable player? No. I just think, given the fact that, you've got a good value contract while he's, on this current cap hit, a dude who's pacing around 60 to 70 points, who has great passing instincts and who's really been elite on the power play and probably fits exactly what Davis Payne wants to do, especially down low. I'm a little hesitant to want to shake that one up. That said, again, everyone does technically have a trade price. And so I would keep an open mind if the right deal came up. But again, it has to be the right deal. And based on teams like Calgary saying, guys like Uyghur and Anderson aren't really for sale. Pettersson apparently kind of going back in the closet, the trade closet for now, not really being available either. The Islanders maybe kind of pulling themselves into the playoff race. Some of those original options have started to sort of taper off. So Winnipeg might have to start really getting creative and looking elsewhere. But there was an interesting article about, available defenders from Murat Atesh of The Athletic, and I want to talk about what some of these suggestions from him were and how much I actually want to see any of these guys on the Jets. Generally speaking, I will say, bit of a spoiler, most of the list is not super interesting to me, but there are a couple of names that I think would make sense. We'll talk about that in just a brief moment. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we're chatting about, some potential trade options and stuff, and specifically for the Jets, Murat Atesh of The Athletic put together an article about defenders, a number of guys who could potentially be available. Now, most of this list is not super interesting to me. There's guys like Seth Jones, Ivan Provorov, David Savard. Those guys, I would probably avoid for the most part. The names that do stick out and some guys that I think could be of interest, let's start off with the one that I would personally say is actually relatively likely given the Jets have tried to get this guy before. It's Rasmus Ristolainen. Now, Ristolainen has come a long way under Torts. He used to be a player that everyone made fun of when he was with Buffalo. Kind of like Logan Stanley, I think he was always sort of miscast as this big shutdown sort of D, and that's just not really his game. He's also not really an offensive wonderkind, and maybe that's something that teams sort of thought he would be. Instead, it's more his defensive impact that's kind of been the more noticeable trend with him. Now, some of his value was from drawing penalties, but it seems like, generally speaking, Torts has gotten to, help him remove some of the chaos out of his game. He also has term. And this is where Ristolainen for me is actually legitimately interesting. As a big right-handed dude who's relatively mobile and is signed at just over $5 million, it's not a trade that I hate. I think the price tag on Ristolainen's probably not crazy. I don't think it would be out of reach for the Jets. And the other thing it might do is replace Pionk. After this season, right, Neil's going to be looking for anywhere from $6 to $7 million. And I just don't really want the Jets to be inking a contract of that size. I love Neil the person. I think he's fit really well with Sandberg. You can't have a player who only works well with one defensive partner signed for $6 to $7 million. It's not a good use of cap space. And I'm not going to sit here and say that Ristolainen is a guy that I inherently trust either. I've got questions about his game. Offensively, I don't think that he's as prolific as I'd like him to be. But as a solid two-way defender who signed at a not crazy cap hit, especially with the ceiling going up pretty high next year, almost to $98 million, I don't really hate it, And if that's your replacement and your stopgap until Salamanson is probably ready to take on second pair of duties behind DeMello, or even, maybe they swapped him and DeMello at some point, I don't hate it. It makes sense. I think that there's a real trade situation there, and maybe the Jets even try and get another forward out of there. I do kind of worry it'd be like a Scott Lawton type, who Lawton as a person, I love. He seems like a super great guy. In terms of the actual, offensive ability and stuff, that's probably where the rest of the game kind of comes into question. But, at the very least, Winnipeg, if they're into Ristolainen, I don't hate it. Not for Ehlers, mind you. That was one of the old rumored trades. I would not do that. But certainly, if you work out a more modest package, I could see something making sense. Another guy on the list that does actually stand out is Keandre Miller. Miller has had a crazy season with the Rangers. I think as a big, strong, smooth skating defender who has a lot of chaos in his game right now, I think getting him away from the Rangers would probably be for the best. I forget who he was playing with. It might have been like Lindgren or something, but whoever he was with on the pairing away from Fox, it just wasn't working out, and I think a lot of his confidence has kind of been sapped. But um, if the Rangers were willing to move him at a not super expensive price, you could consider him an interesting reclamation project. Do I think the Jets should go, out of their way to acquire him? Probably not, but he would be interesting if you can find him a good partner and somebody who can maybe help him calm his game down. A Miller pairing would also be kind of funny if that's something that happens. I think that there could actually be some success there. Again, there's some risk with Keandre, and he is an RFA. He's pretty young, and I don't think the Rangers are necessarily intent on moving him. But if he does get moved and is not too expensive, I'd be willing to sort of entertain that. One of the last guys I could also see being potentially of interest, it is Brian Dumoulin. Dumoulin's been around for forever at this point. He's a solid big D who kind of blocks shots, generally makes good clean exit passes. He's not like crazy in transition, and I think there are some limitations to his game, but if you're looking for somebody with some real veteran experience, who's had a couple of rings, who's been around the league a long time, and who does kind of like the DeMello dad sort of thing of being just a very calming presence, I think you'd actually get pretty good value out of him. He is on the older side, and he's not exactly fast, but I think he brings pretty significant defensive value and somebody who could probably be that third pairing anchor that the Jets are frankly looking for right now. I don't think Hanel or Stanley or Fleury are really the answers there at the moment. But if you have like a Dumoulin Miller pairing, I have all the time in the world for that. So I think that he'd be affordable. I don't think the Ducks would really be asking a king's ransom. And for the Jets, he kind of makes their makes sense for their like window. Interesting thing, right? I just think that the Jets have lots of options, and I think that they could go a couple of different directions here. From my take, I do think that they want a forward and a defender, right? Specifically, a big, smooth skating defender, which everyone wants. I don't think that is nearly as in big supply. I will say that. There are guys who fit that mold off of this list, but most of them have pretty poor defensive results. So I've tried to identify guys that I think are legitimately decent and who could probably upgrade the Jets D. One player that's not on this list that I'm seeing some talk about is Colton Parayko. Parayko, again, another player who maybe was miscast as an offensive blue liner because he does slap the puck really hard. The thing with Parayko is that he is kind of signed for a long time. He's also got a no-trade clause that does kind of convert into like some sort of modified clause towards the end of his contract. But he is signed for a long time. He is 31, and the cap hit's not cheap. I like him in some instances. He's big and smooth skating, and I think him with Morrissey or him with Sandberg would be dominant. But I just kind of wonder how all of that would shake out. I would actually think it would almost be like the Blues needing to pay the Jets to take on his deal. The salary after the season is less of a concern, but I do think that there's some sweating there. I didn't really want to pay Pionk the same amount, so I'm not sure that I necessarily want to pay Parayko the same amount, especially when he's already at 31 years of age. So it's an interesting one. If the Blues made it cheap enough, which I think it would be, I'd be interested to kind of take a look at it. I don't know that I would be pining for this deal, but I'm listening. If the price is right, I won't say no to most things. And that's kind of where, the big question is, what is too much, right? And, Parayko might be a little more affordable than some of the other options if you're willing to take the risk on the contract. But curious to know what you think about this D list. Is there anyone there that you would have really liked to see? Drop your comments below or at my social medias at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Tomorrow's episode, we will have, of course, a recap of Winnipeg versus Carolina, hoping my score prediction at least somewhat verifies. But again, drop your score predictions below. For tonight's episode, though, that's going to be all the time that we have. Thank you so much for listening and making us your first listen of the day, every day. We'll see you back here tomorrow, so see you then. Have a great night, and as always, go Jets go.